I'm glad to be here anyway. This is actually the second time I'm participating in this conference. The first time was in 2008. That was the first time, I think, ever we had this conference. It was in Swedish back then. And I remember the feeling we had, the atmosphere, and the urgency that we felt back then, 10 years ago. And I must say that very little has happened since then. In fact, things have gotten much, much worse in the past 10 years. And even I remember my childhood in 1962, when I was 2 years old, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was published. And the awareness of environmental destruction became sort of a general sentiment. It entered the political sphere. Okay, okay. And in the early 70s, there was this hit song called, the refrain was, we got to do it now, we can't go on forever. I think this was in 1972 or 1973. So even back then, there was this urgency that something needs to be done. But for some reason, we seem to be incapable of making the profound changes that we should. I feel a bit distracted by Alf's presence, but I appreciate it at the same time. Okej. Är det någonting jag kan göra? Okay. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about hope. It was an extremely difficult topic to prepare. I talked to Malin. What should I talk about? And I could talk about Native Americans because that's what I've done previously, and people usually appreciate it. It's always nice to hear about indigenous cultures. But I felt that the question of hope and hopelessness was kind of urgent. So I took it upon myself to say a few words about this. And it proved to be more difficult than I had hoped for, I must confess. So all I can really do is present some maybe half-digested thoughts and fragments that would serve possibly and hopefully as an introduction to a discussion about hope and hopelessness. I did my anthropological fieldwork on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota among the Oglala Lakota. And this picture was taken about 9 years ago outside of a sweat lodge. The Lakota call this the ritual the inikarapi, which means to make life, to produce and reproduce life. And this is the way I look when I'm happy. It happens quite seldom, so take a close look. Anyway, some general remarks on hope. Hope appears in the gap between that which is the case and that which is not, between the actual state and sort of a desired state. And although hope is always directed towards the future or some other point, some other position, geographically or temporarily, it always has an effect in the present. And also, hope is ethically neutral. Hope is not by itself a good thing. To hope for an expanded Lebensraum is a hope, but it's not a good thing in itself. So let's keep hope as a neutral, ethically and morally neutral term. Some further distinctions. There is the specific hope that is tied to a limited and defined goal. For instance, that I hope it will not rain on Midsummer's Eve, or that my favorite football team will win the game, or something like that. And then there's the existential hope that is tied to an overall and carrying life goal. That my child will survive, that my marriage will not break up, or that's something that is really tied to my life situation as a whole. And then there's the individual hope and the collective hope. Individual hope that takes the forms of dreams. And we are very much encouraged by popular culture. Our youngest daughter is 11 years old, and she watches these Barbie and Disney movies where the message is always the same. Go for your dreams. As long as you dream, you can become anything. So keep the dream alive. But it's always a dream about changing one's own individual position within an existing system. I may live in a class society, but if I dream of becoming a princess, I might one day actually become a princess by marrying the beautiful prince. And then there's the collective hope that takes the form of utopias, and that is linked to the transformation of the system itself. We have a lot of dreams, but we have very few utopias. And I would say even that today utopias tend to be replaced by retrotopias. There's a very strong nostalgic movement moving across the world, and we can see this all over the place in Europe and in the United States, where an idealized future is replaced by the image of an idealized past. Now, usually when we talk about hope as a mental state, as an attitude, something sort of like a psychological condition. Hope is not a dream, but a way of making dreams become reality. And hope is also something that is seen as, it gives energy. It urges us to act. It gives us the energy to act and take initiatives. We have to have hope. And hope will direct us towards the future and towards our goals. Now, this is partly true. Yes, hope gives us energy, but hope also requires energy. Job says in the book of Job, "What strength do I have that I should continue to hope?" Hope is a heavy burden, and it might be a relief to let hope go. And this is where I come to the British philosopher John Cleese, from whom I borrow the heading for my presentation today. You might have seen this film. It's called Clockwise, from 1986. John Cleese acts in the role of the headmaster, Brian Stimpson, whose whole life revolves around punctuality. An extremely pedantic man. And he's going to this conference to give a keynote speech. And to cut a long story short, everything goes wrong. He gets a ride with one of his former students, Laura. He winds up in a monastery, but he's still struggling. There's still this microscopic chance that he might make it. And in this specific sequence, he says to Laura, "It's not the despair, Laura. I can take the despair. It's the hope I can't stand." And when I heard this the first time, I felt that there is a profound wisdom here. And I'm still trying to figure out what that wisdom is. So let's look at mental states and structural conditions. And I will make a sort of a detour via fear, which also has interest in me. We might separate between a specific fear that is directed towards a specific object. And this kind of fear is a necessity for survival for all species and all individuals. Without that kind of fear, we would not have survived as individuals or as a species. It's a fear directed towards a specific object, and once that object disappears, we're not afraid anymore. Then there is another kind of fear, a generalized fear, and we've seen this picture, I think it was yesterday. A generalized fear is fear without an object, and in its strongest and most intense form is called angst, anguish, ångest, which is a destructive force in the life of the individual and the collective. And it's an unbearable fear because it's a fear that is part of the life's very foundation, its pattern. And since it's such a terrible form of fear, we seek to sort of attach this fear to something, a scapegoat, a witch, an ethnic minority, or whatever. Now, this is on the left we have a floor plan, and on the right we have furniture. And furniture is something that we can move them around, we can replace them, we can buy new furniture, and these are kind of ingredients in our house, in our home. And if fear is an ingredient in our lives, it's something that also can be removed and overcome and be replaced. But once fear becomes part of the very floor plan, it will structure the way we move and how we see things, the angle from which we see things. So there is a structural fear that is not in the heads of people or in the emotions of people, but that is in the structure of society itself. This is from the central station in Stockholm, and I think that this message has been recently replaced by another one. But up until quite recently, you could hear this in the loudspeakers. We recommend you not to let anyone unknown help you with your luggage. That is, we recommend you to distrust your fellow human beings. What I'm trying to say here is that the individuals walking around here, including myself, are not afraid. Because we don't have to be, because fear is built into the structure itself. It's no longer a mental condition, okay, but a structural one. I can remember my oldest daughter, Siri, was born in 1990, and so she turns 28 in just a few days. And back then, you could still see baby carriages placed outside of shops and cafeterias in Uppsala, in downtown Uppsala. And Siri was one of those children, sleeping outside. And we could sit in a cafe and we could look out at the baby carriage, and it was out there, and if she moved, we took her in if she woke up. Otherwise, she could sleep there. My youngest daughter was born in 2006, and it has never, ever occurred to me to leave her outside, even for a second. What has changed? Has the kidnapping of children, small children, increased dramatically? Has society become much, much more dangerous than it used to be back in 1990? No. Society has not changed fundamentally in that sense, but what has changed are the attitudes. I have changed, not society. It has sort of slipped into the very foundation of how I act in society. So, if you are with me on this, that we can act fear without feeling fear by locking doors or acting in certain ways. For instance, a few years ago, I made sort of an existential journey through Sweden. I visited the chapel where I was baptized by my grandfather in 1961, and I had never been there since I was baptized. So I came there. There was this small chapel in Hagfors, Värmland. And I drove up there, I locked my car, I walked to the chapel, and the chapel was locked. End of story. I never came in. And this is the church that tells us, do not be afraid, have no fear, listen to the words of Jesus Christ or the angels, have no fear. I'm not implying that the people employed in this church are afraid, but fear is built into the actions, or mistrust. And I would also suggest that we can act hope even if we don't feel hope. Hope is in the eye of the beholder. A person and or a phenomenon can express hope and carry hope without feeling hope. This is an image of a pregnant woman. I'm not sure about her mental condition, if she feels hopeful or not, but it is an image that conveys hope. It expresses hope in itself. So, fear needs no object. I think that is quite clear. And fear without an object can be a very powerful force. In this case, a destructive force. And the question that I would like to pose, but I'm not sure I can answer it, is whether hope also can exist without an object. Does hope need an object? That is, can we hope without hoping for something? And I would suggest that we can, and that hope without an object can be an as powerful force as fear without an object, but in a very positive sense. I read this book by Jane Goodall a number of years ago, Reason for Hope, A Spiritual Journey, and it was a hopeful book, I would say. But this is hope that, reason for hope implies that I hope because of. I have a reason for hoping. But the kind of hope that I'm after here is hope without having a reason for hope. Generalized hope does not hinge upon a realistic assessment of the future. Generalized hope is not an expression of naivete, but of resistance. And we all know that love needs no reason. We can never explain our love because it's inexplicable. It's called grace in Christian language, a gift. Love is acting without motivation. And if love is an act of grace, then maybe hope also might be an act of grace. You see, I give you all these fragments. You have to put these pieces together by yourselves afterwards. I would also say that agency is a very important aspect of hope. That is the sense of being able to act in the world. Let's make a detour to the first time a telegraph was sent. This was back in 1844 when the Morse telegraph alphabet had been invented. For the first time, urgent information, could travel over very long distances. Before this time, there were urgent messages, of course, around, but they were always locally produced. The Huns are coming, the building is on fire, a lion is attacking, somebody was screaming, there was an input of information, and we could react on that information. With the telegraph, we started a new phase in information technology, in the sense that all of a sudden we can now have urgent information without having the capacity to act. So there is a break between the input and output. And this is the world that we live in today to a large extent. Every time we watch the news on television, we have an input of urgent news, of people suffering, and there's nothing really we can do sitting in our couches. And this is a new phase, and there are different versions about how to react on this. One is despair, which is quite common. The other is numbness or apathy. A world in which we cannot act is no longer our world. This is to make the world my own, I need to be able to feel that I have an impact on this world, that I am a subject in this world, not only someone that is acted upon, an object for other people's actions. So how do I turn the world into my world? I imagine that this little boy has just received the news that his parents are getting a divorce, that his life situation will change fundamentally. Now, this information is too big for him. It's too much for him to take in. So he has to reformat this information, reformat his world to make it manageable. So he turns it into a game, a play, where he can experience agency. And this is what rituals always do. Ritual recreates the world in a form that allows us to act in it. It reformats the world to a different size. And in this reformatted world, we are incorporated as agents and subjects rather than objects. Yes. This is a film that you might have seen, Livet är underbart, Life is wonderful, La vita è bella, by Roberto Benigni. And have you seen this film? Okay, many of you have. There is something about this film that really touched me, and I think it touched all of us who have seen it or somehow affected by it and touched by it. It's about a father of Jewish background. He and his son wind up in a concentration camp. And in order for the boy to survive, the father recreates the concentration camp. He is enacting hope, and I will make it easy. I'll just read my own text here. In the film, a father and his little son are brought to a concentration camp during World War II. And what does the father do? He tells his son that it's all a game, that the other prisoners and the prison guards are all part of an exciting play. The father acts in the midst of despair, But what is the direction and aim of his actions? Is he acting against the Nazis? Is he changing the world? Is he trying to close down the prison camp? No, he's not motivated by political goals, but by the love for his son. By loving in a world where others hate and fear, he retains his humanity. He does not abandon it when life seems to go towards its inevitable end. He becomes more human, not less. What are the alternatives to hope? Well, the most obvious answer would be hopelessness. This is how we tend to think of it. I have given up all hope. I go into a state of hopelessness and despair. But there is also, and this is where John Cleese is at, approximately. He's very close to giving up his hope. He's very close to despair, but he still has a small, slight chance of hope left. Then there's the other version, which is relinquishment, acceptance, relief, or trust, which in a sense is sort of giving in to something else. It might be to give in to an enemy, which is a horrendous experience, but it might also be to sort of give in to God or a higher power, a sense that there is nothing left for me to do. All I can do now is rest. And sometimes that condition of relief and relinquishment in itself creates something unpredictably new. And then there is presence, which is hopelessness in a very, very positive sense. There is no hope because no hope is needed. It's fulfillment. It is the experience a newly delivered mother has when the baby is placed on her breast. There is nothing to hope for. There is no gap between the actual state of affairs and a desired state of affairs. I am there. It is a kind of presence. Hope is, in my first version, I wrote hope is an obligation. But it's too harsh and too moralizing, because hope is not a moral obligation for any individual. But I think that hope is a moral obligation for society. Hope is a commitment, and when one person loses hope, there must be others who are able to carry it on. There must be someone else we can hand over our hope to. I can hope no longer. Will you please do it for me? And for this reason, hope needs to be organized, institutionalized, and embodied in social structures and social practices. And the expression of hopelessness gives it a communicable form and meaning. Hopelessness needs a language. And in a secularized society, in a desacralized world, I think that we have, to a large extent, lost an existential language as a whole, but in particular, a language of hopelessness. Hope because of, that is, a reason for hope, is increasingly being replaced, perhaps, by a hope that is in spite of. And this is, I must say, the only hope I can carry. Hope as some kind of resistance, hope in spite of the things, of the state of things in the world. Hope is also relating to the world and to the other as if there is something else. In the Christian tradition, we have there's the notion of man, humans being the image, created in the image of God, and of Christ being sort of the signature, God's signature in all of us. And of course, if I act in relation to other people as if they were manifestations of God, I will relate to them quite differently than I would if I saw them as manifestations of only flesh and blood, for instance. Hope is therefore also a cure for cynicism. It is impossible to be hopeful and cynical at the same time. Hope entails a sense of a capacity to act and a willingness to act. I think this might be my last picture, and I just gave you these fragments at the end. Let's see. No. There's apparently one more. Hope is resistance. but hope is not experienced as resistance. I think that is an important point. If we are to challenge the powers and principalities of this world, we cannot be driven by a protest against them. These powers and principalities are only fundamentally challenged and shaken when they are challenged by another power. French philosopher Michel Foucault reminds us that resistance is an expression of the power that it resists. So in that sense, resistance is yet another manifestation of power. The question is then, what kind of resistance will shake the powers? Well, a resistance that is not rooted in the powers that it resists. Thank you.